And I greatly appreciate you guys joining us on a Friday afternoon as we have some contract conversations. And hopefully you've gotten the materials that Lori sent out, the contract form and some addenda, and my question concepts one-page form. Hopefully you have that, because we'll start with that. And please feel free to unmute yourself and say hi.
Hi, Bob. How you feeling?
Hi, how we doing? And there's Larry, there's Marcia.
Yep.
Hey, Bob.
And is that Jeannie or Doug, Weezer's iPhone?
It's actually Jana Ward.
Jana Ward. So Jana Ward, your ID here is Weezer's iPhone?
Yep, my nickname since childhood has always been Weezer.
Really? I don't think I knew that. Wow. Learn
I
new
didn't
stuff
tell you.
every day. Hello, Miss Marcia.
Hi, how are you?
You know, I'm doing wondrous. You know, for a few minutes there, it was just Jaylyn and I, and you know, she's got her picture up there. And then slowly but surely, other folks decided, well, it's Friday. I don't have anything else to do.
Right, exactly.
I hear Bob's going to talk about contracts. So, you know, why not?
Exactly.
I'll see what he's got to say. You know, he might say something that you'll find interesting. I don't know. It could happen. I'm certainly open to the possibilities.
Well, me too.
I see, Marcia, I see you're on an island somewhere, just like I'm on the beach with the waves coming in.
It's the Amalfi Coast.
The what
in
coast?
Italy. Amalfi.
Oh, really? Okay.
Wow.
Good. Wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Gotta love that.
very pretty there.
Yep.
How's Elizabeth?
She's still struggling. It's been really slow with her, and she's going through some cycles, and you know, we're kind of consulting with her doctors. You know, she's got some challenging underlying health issues that I think are really causing it to be much slower for her to in some way recover. I mean, I'm feeling a lot better. I still have my moments, but certainly much better what she's doing. So thanks for asking. We're really concerned with how she's doing. So we're watching that.
Please give her our best and tell her we're
I
thinking
will.
about her.
Absolutely. I will. Well, Adrienne, she's shown up now. There's Morgan. Slowly but surely we get more. And Amanda, good. Okay, it's 1:30. And I think to reward those folks who showed up on time, I'd like for us to go ahead and get started. And hopefully you do have the materials. You've got that one-page thing that says question concepts, and then you've got copies of the contract form and certain addenda. So hopefully you have that so we can work through it. I don't know if Lori is my host or Laura, and can share the screen with the contract question concepts. I don't know who we have there, that we can maybe put things up on the screen. We're kind of going through it and see what we may have, but hopefully all of you have at least got that one-page form there of concepts. So do I have Lori or Laura? Who do I have hosting that has the material that put up on the screen? Anybody? Do I have anybody? Okay. So let's at least, hopefully you have that one-page question concepts, and while I'm kind of semi-waiting for someone to show up to help with it, let's talk about, because we're going to use the concepts of questions as we go through and deal with the contract forms and addenda, and deal with the questions that we continue to find on a regular basis that you have for me and for Marcia and the agent hotline, and and of each other as you work through it. And there'll never be an end to the questions, and that's good, because that shows that we're all involved in it, and you'll always have questions because we're dealing with people, and people get up way early in the morning coming up with new ways to look at things as we kind of work through things. So first thing that we can talk about the question concepts, and hopefully you have it there, and I've got actually 7 concepts on that one-page thing, so hopefully you got that, and we'll talk about it and work through it. So we'll use these concepts as we go through and look at questions in the contract and the addenda, and look at the actual examples. So the first concept is asking the right person may be more important than the question itself. Somebody give me a sense of that concept, and if you say, well, isn't that pretty obvious, or what does that mean, or how is that? Give me some feedback on what you think about that first concept. Asking the right person may be more important than the question itself.
Well, you want to make sure that you're asking someone who has experience and can answer the question, and
Okay.
not necessarily someone who hasn't faced that situation or doesn't know that answer.
Okay, so Marcia's looking at this from the perspective of, you have a question maybe about the offer or the transaction, and you're going to ask a different agent, another agent in the office, about that. And, one of the things that one of our people on our RISE thing the other day talked about is that when she first got started, and she, Sally Bett, I believe, was in the office in the computer room, and it was really helpful for her to have access to information from experienced people as she would ask those questions. Now, as Marcia points out, when you ask questions of another agent, you need to make sure that their experience, sometimes you'll ask a question of an agent who's had a license 10 minutes longer than you have, and that may not be the best source. So when you're looking for those kind of technical answers, and you're looking to other agents around the office, that's one of the reasons we have the agent hotline. So you can call the agent hotline, talk to some experienced people that answer those questions, going through that process. And Marcia is one of the people on the hotline who can answer those questions. And then if there's something that the hotline says, well, I don't know, maybe we should bring Bob into this. And so then it comes to me and we can deal with it. So there's another aspect of this. That's one way to view this, the right person versus the question itself. But what if you're working with a client, buyer or seller, and there's something going on in the transaction and you need some information? Who you ask can be really important as you work through the process. And you'll find that there are different shades, different levels of this. Let's say, for example, and this is an example that actually we find ourselves making use of in one of our other concepts here, but you've got a buyer and you're completing an offer and they're obtaining financing, and you're there on paragraph 1 of the contract, and there's a blank there for the buyer. It's going to be one of those natural conversations that you'll have with the buyer about what do we want to put in that blank. And so you may ask buyer, says, okay, here's where we put your name in this first paragraph. You're one of the 2 parties, and there are only 2 parties to the contract, regardless of how many people there are. There might be, 12 sellers and 3 buyers, doesn't matter. There are 2 parties, seller and a buyer. And so you say to your buyer, says, okay, what name do we want to use here? Now, you may be a really, really busy agent. I mean, you're just out showing lots of houses and you're working with 10 different buyers. And it would not be a good conversation to say to that buyer, says, this is where we put your name. And I know I've shown you 30 houses so far. Remind me again, what's your name? probably not a good question. Probably don't want to say, you're going to have to couch it. So here's where we actually put the name. We can put that there. So now, if there's financing, as I mentioned in this example, you'll want to have a conversation with someone else, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. You'll want to talk to the buyer's lender. Buyer's lender may have a preference. Some lenders have a requirement, and they say, here's the name we're using on all the loan docs. We're using it on the promissory note. We're using it on the truth in lending statement. We're using it in the deed of trust. That's their legal name that we have in the loan application. And so the lender may say, our policy is the name in the contract needs to be exactly the same as on our financial documents. Now, you'll have that conversation, and you'll ask the loan officer, say, okay, so in the contract itself, writing off with the buyer, we've had a conversation about their qualifications and so forth. What's your lender's policy on what goes in the contract? And so you've asked them that. So now when you're talking to your buyer about what goes in here, your question to them is going to reflect the fact that you've already had a conversation, a question and an answer from their lender. And so you can say to your buyer, says, okay, I've had a conversation with your lender, and they have certain preferences about what goes to the contract. So, Mr. and Ms. Buyer, are you good with putting in the offer what your lender requires to be in the contract? Is that good for you? Because remember, they're in control. They're going to write an offer. They get to decide what the heck they're going to do. It's important information for them as you ask this question. It's important information for them to know, here's what their lender says. And if they're not happy with what their lender says, then that's a different conversation. And they need to have a conversation with their lender. They may need to change the lenders. They may decide to go to a cash deal. Say, I don't want anybody controlling what we're going to do here. But that's an important conversation you're going to have. And knowing the right people to ask to get to that final answer that you're going to work with is pretty important. Does that make sense? Do we see the right person? You need to know enough about the process that when you're going to decide and get to this point where you're writing an offer and you're going to put a name in here for the buyer, you need to know what else is involved. You need to know what's going on here. We talk about this in the classes. For example, if there's not any financing and it's a cash transaction, the buyer has a lot of latitude. But the important thing for the buyer is whatever name they use in the contract, that's a name that's going to show up unless they change it, unless they do something with the title company and title company attorneys. That's going to be the name that more than likely will show up on their deed, on their warranty deed. And so when they get ready to sell the house in 5 years, if they've got a name here in the contract that shows up on the deed that may be different than their legal name in their, all their IDs, they may have a problem proving up that they in fact are this person on the deed who's trying to sell the property. So they need to look down the road and see whatever they do now may impact on things in the future. Does that make semi-sense? Sometimes we get into the right person in that you may have two sellers, for example, husband and wife sellers, and it's going to be really important as you go through the process that you treat them equally and they understand you represent all of them and they give you good information. But very often when you have a situation like that where your one client, your party client is a couple of people, you're going to learn fairly quickly who's got the information, who's going to provide you the information, who you're going to go to for information about certain kinds of things. Even though they're both going to be making decisions in the transaction, you'll find that for some questions, it's more important for you to ask her than to ask him. In fact, he may not even be available, or vice versa as it works through it. So knowing for a particular question who the right person is, if you're asking the wrong person, it's not a good question. In fact, whatever answer you get probably won't help you move forward with anything. So, the right person asking the right person questions is really, really important. Now, second question, and please be sure if you've got examples or questions about any of these, stop me, slow me down, say, whoa, Bob, what's going on here? Second one, how a question is asked is very important. How you ask the question is critical, is huge. Somebody give me a little bit of a sense of what I mean by that. Explain that to me a little bit. What do you think? Unmute yourself and explain it. I'm open to the concept.
You need to make sure you have all the facts when you are asking the question, that you're giving the facts to the person you're asking.
Okay, I agree with that. But now look at the way I phrase the question. How a question is asked. In other words, the manner in which you ask the question. As you go
Respectfully.
through the process. So how you ask it, how you go through that process, how you approach your client, buyer or seller, and ask them a question. I mean, there are ways, for example, you got the seller, it's a listing, and one of the important things that you'll want the seller to do is complete a seller's disclosure notice.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're a little slow in getting that done. You probably don't want to say to your seller, hey, you got this done yet? Why? Do you not understand? I've told you 3 or 4 times, this is important. When you get this done, have you got it done yet? No. Instead, you'll ask that question in a manner that's much more respectful. You say, I appreciate you've got some things going on. We got the COVID, we got, all those things. But let's talk about what can happen if we get an offer into a contract and we don't have the sales disclosure notice completed by you yet. Let's talk about what that might do to the contract. Let's have a conversation so you're more comfortable with what's going on here, and you're not pushing them for something. You're not pushing them in your question. You're giving them the opportunity. You'll find that this is a little bit of concept number 7 we'll talk about shortly. But how you approach them, how you ask that. You're the buyer's agent, and you don't have in MLS. There is no seller's disclosure notice, and so you call the listing agent up. You say, "Hey, where is the seller's disclosure? Are you a new agent? Do you not know how this? Why do we don't have it yet?" I mean, you're not going to ask questions that way. You're going to ask questions that are respectful, that move the relationship forward as you work through it. I mean, you're going to do that. How we ask the question, remembering that probably one of the most key features in everything we're doing with everybody we do it is to show respect. We've got to be respectful. If we're respectful, it will change how we ask, how we answer, how we talk. And you need to be at that level. We understand the concept. It's more prevalent today than it's ever been. You've got to be patient. You've got to be respectful. Everybody is fighting some kind of battle. I'm going through a situation right now. I'm doing really good. Elizabeth's struggling, but we're going through that. And one of the things we discovered is we were going through the COVID. So are a jillion other people. Some of them far worse situation. I mean, we've got one extended family, not a direct family, but extended family of.
Oh, crap.
And one of them died.
Oh.
Wow. That hadn't happened to us yet. So whatever you got going on, somebody else has got going on 10 times worse.
Yep.
So be respectful, work through that. And by being respectful, it's going to change how you ask the questions. It's going to change how you work through that process. So when I talk about how we ask it, that's kind of where I'm trying to go. Don't ask it in a demanding manner. Even if who you have on the other side of the transaction, that's how they're doing things. Even if you've got somebody on the other side that's being difficult, that's not being respectful, that's giving you all kinds of grief, deal with it. Don't in return do that to them. And yet there's a tendency to do it. We know the human nature factor kicks in. One of our agents, and she's a good agent. She's a good producing agent, but she's got a little bit of a personality trait about her. And she gets a little combative. I mean, that's just kind of her nature. That's just how she is. And I get a call from an agent on the other side of the transaction. actually got a call from their broker. And they were complaining about how my agent was really being snippy and combative and not cooperative. And so, I kind of thought about that. And as Marcia knows, as many of you know, whenever I have a situation where somebody is critical of one of you, I have an enormous bias towards my agents. I always give my agents the benefit of the doubt. I always say, you know what? I appreciate the information. Let me talk to the agent. Because when I talk to the agent, it's 100% different scenario. So they told us about, so I called our agent, who I just described. And she was really defensive. She said, "Boy, that's just wrong. That's just wrong, man. They're accusing me of being snippy. I'm never snippy." Well, it'd been one of those days, and I probably shouldn't have been as honest as I was. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, I said, "You know what? You're snippy with me. Mm-hmm. Why would I not think you're snippy with everybody else you're dealing with? Because you're doing it right now with me." And so she kind of had to back off a little bit. But we do that. We have our personalities. We have our things. When you're in a transaction, you need to overcome those natural tendencies, and you need to try to, be nice. I've got one of those little boards or things in my office that has a little slogan, a motto kind of thing on it. And I sometimes am given a little bit of grief for having it there. And it says, "I'll be nicer if you'll try to be smarter." Now, the underlying concept is good, but I can't do that. I can't say, well, my agent's not trying, so it's okay for me to not be nice to them. Well, that's not true. But the human nature factor is that's kind of how we are. I mean, it's just a little bit of that situation. And we have to overcome it because it'll come back and it'll bite you every single time. Any questions or comments on that? Because how we ask it is just so incredibly important. Now, let's go to the third one. A question is not only a request for information, it is also the delivery of information. Explain that to me. What do we think that means? You're asking somebody a question. You're also giving them information. Somebody help me explain what the heck that means. Somebody who has control over the mute button and who can actually unmute themselves.
You could explain how important the correct answer is, or the honest answer is.
Okay, and I agree with that. But when you ask a question, let's say you're asking the buyer how much they want to offer. What do we put in 3C for a price? Maybe you're going to ask them what kind of closing date. Maybe you're going to ask them how many days do they want to put to get the sales disclosure notice or mandatory HOA. When you ask one of those questions,
778.
What is kind of the information you're giving them
161.
by asking the question?
Okay.
What information should they be pulling from the fact that you just asked them a question? Think about it. You just asked a question. What do you want them to think about? Not just think about the question and give you an answer and give you information. You just gave them some information by the very act of asking a question. What is the information you just gave them? What did you just say when you asked that question?
You're wanting to work with them.
You want to work with them.
You're collaborative.
Yeah, you're collaborative. Maybe you're also telling them you're knowledgeable. When you ask what name we should put in the contract and you talked about their lender, you were giving them information. You know what? I know how this works. I understand the process. I've talked to your lender. Here's what they're thinking. Here's something we need to take a look at as you go through the process. The very act of asking a question, as a minimum, the party on the other side should think, okay, my agent asked me a question. That must mean it's important. I hadn't really thought about how many days I wanted to be able to object to something in 7D. I hadn't really thought about that, but my agent just asked me how many days do I want to put in there. So it must be important. And you just gave your buyer information that here's a blank in the contract form, and we need to put a number in there. And I'm asking you what you think we should put in there. Now, you'll clearly follow up with a conversation about it, but the very act of asking them tells them, you know what? A number does go here. 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, and some number goes here. And I just conveyed to you by asking the question. It's important that we know what we're going to put here. I mean, it's more important that we know, my client knows, because I'm asking this, it's important. Now, what you should get back from the client, they just heard you ask a question, you go, okay. First of all, in their mind, there's churning around in the brain. Okay, Bob asked me this, must be important. Must be something we got to talk about. Must be something we're going to come up with. What the client probably is going to come back with, well, I don't know. What are the different variables? What tells me we should put 1 day or 3 days or 5 days or 10 days? What's going on here? Why certain days are good or bad for me or good or bad for the seller? Help me understand what we're even doing here. Buyer may say, I'm not even sure what this whole objection thing is. So you may have to go through a whole conversation about 6D and what they can object to and not object to, and the reason for the big blank and the small blank. But it all came from the information you gave them when you asked them a question, how many days we want to put in there. And once they understand, yeah, okay, I understand. Here's, and we did put in the big blank, want to build a big pool in the backyard. So once I find out that I can or cannot do that, maybe I need a few days to think about that and decide whether or not I'm going to object and still buy the house or not buy the house. And so the buyer may think through it and say, seems to me, because I might get the information on Friday, maybe I need to get through the weekend. Maybe I need at least 3 days to be able to do that. You're having a good conversation and some good dialogue because of the information you gave them when you asked them the question. Does that make sense? Now, here's the base concept of this kind. Here's the sub part of this. You need to be aware every single time you ask a question, regardless of what it is, you're also giving information. You're not just making an inquiry, say, hey, I need this information. You're providing them information just by the very act of asking the question. Now, because of that, you should never ask a question that you don't understand what information you're giving them and what you need for them to do with it. In every single case, you need to have that awareness. So every question you ask is a good question, and they look at it and they say, wow, as a minimum, you want them to pick up that because you asked a question, that's important, and they need to think about what the answer could be. As a minimum, they need to have that. And you need to be aware of that in every question. Now, there's a flip side to this. It's not as prevalent as your concept should be. You should understand this. I mean, hopefully, by having this conversation, you should understand how important it is that you know you're delivering information. Well, guess what? They're doing the same thing to you. When they ask you a question, they're not only asking a question for information, they're also delivering information. When the buyer says to you, their agent, how much do you think we should offer? One, they want the information, and you'll have that conversation going through it and your CMA and the market and how hot the property is and all those kinds of things. Well, what they just also told you is, I understand the offering price in this offer is important. I understand it's important. And that's why I'm taking the time to ask you the question. And what that client, what that buyer just conveyed to us is they now are on board with, this is an important question. This is an important factor. the price we put in the offer is really important. And when I ask you, my agent, that question, I acknowledge, yeah, this is important. And they delivered that information to you. That makes good sense. Any comments or questions or whatever on that so far? Okay. The fourth concept. A good question is only effective if it is followed by effective listening. This has far-reaching impact. One of our challenges with questions is that when you ask a question, if you don't stop and listen, you just wasted your time asking the question. One of the reasons that we use scripts in listings and in buyers, and we use scripts in a lot of our activities, is we know what we're going to say, and we don't have to think about what we're going to say. We can spend our time listening. In a script, you'll go through the process and you'll ask questions and you'll make comments and you'll provide information. And because you know what you're going to say, you don't have to sit there and ask a question and then immediately start thinking through your brain and say, okay, now what was my next question? What's my next question? Which means you're not listening to them. Because if you're mentally focused on anything else, you literally do not hear what they say. And so as you go through the process, it's one of the reasons to have scripts. When you ask a question, pause, stop. Now, a couple of things happen when you do that. One, you put yourself in the mode of listening. And the other, and it's a good trait, when you pause, you are showing them that you've asked a question and you're going to respect them to come up with an answer. And you don't need a quick, fast answer. It depends on the kind of person they are, how they analyze, how they go through it. Very analytical person, you may get impatient, and don't be, because they may take some real time thinking through it. They say, oh, wow, that's a great question. Another one person who's a absolutely type A personality, push, may give a quick and immediate answer. I mean, just right off the top of their head. And you've learned that you can't really trust all of those quick answers as you go through the process because they haven't really thought through it yet. They just right off the top of their head gave an answer. So by pausing, ask a question and stopping and waiting for an answer, you're showing great respect to them. My father, I'm a second generation realtor, but this is just a personality of his. When he'd ask a question, he'd stop, he'd wait. He wouldn't say anything. And sometimes when I was around and he did that, there was a deafening silence. Because, sometimes he just stood there. He just said nothing. And I'm sitting there going, well, let's say something. Let's talk. Let's explain our question. Let's, what? And he wouldn't. And what he discovered, one, by not saying anything, by waiting, it showed respect for them. And they liked that. And they were more inclined to treat his question with respect and give a good answer. The other thing he found out when he asked a question and he took his time and they didn't answer it and they went right on to other things, he realized it wasn't an important question. It wasn't important because they just now moved on to 2 or 3 other things. And he just got the information that without them saying anything and answering the question, their actions moving forward told him, okay, I just found out that, the color of the carpet, the location, the neighborhood, close to school, it wasn't important because they just moved right on. And he learned a lot of stuff by the way he did it. But mostly he just said, you know what, if I'll wait and if they don't give me a good answer, wasn't a question that was important and we'll just move on. So got to follow with effective listening. We talk about listening a lot. I don't think there's anybody of 39 people on this call who don't understand the concept of listening. And I think we've all been in a situation where we got very frustrated because we felt like we weren't being listened to as you work through it. And we all understand that up here somewhere that it's important. But the reality is you need to have it as a very regular habit. I mean, you just need to make it part of how you do things. That when you're in conversations and you're dealing with people, you're doing it in such a way that it's clear to them when you ask a question, you're going to wait and you expect an answer. And doing this will help communicate to that to them in a really effective way. Questions, comments, anything on that?
I have a comment, Bob. It's Jana.
Yes. Yes, Jana.
By asking questions, it also applies a responsibility to our client as well. That they're responsible for giving us information. They're responsible for making some of these decisions. It's not all on us. They're in charge. And so they have to hold some responsibility.
That's a really good point, Jana, and you're exactly right. As you go through this process, and I think that's a really important point that Jana makes, we want our client to understand they are the decision maker and they have a responsibility to make decisions. You know, we say that in casual ways, like when they say, well, gee, I don't know what you think, should I buy this house? Hey, it's not my money. I'm not living there. And you know, we understand that's a little bit flippant, but the reality is when we ask questions, we're putting the responsibility on them. Jana's absolutely right. We're asking for information from them, letting them know these things are important, but we're also telling them, you're the client, you're the decision maker, and you are responsible for those decisions. I'm asking questions, I'm giving you information. You've got everything you possibly could need from me going through this process. Now, so that's an incredibly important point. Thank you, Jana. Now, there's another little side to this as you work through it. One of our challenges in asking questions and in providing information, you know, there's a question on one of the quizzes, you know, it says, and it's a true or false question, it says, and TREC has a requirement, for example, that an agent is required to provide information, all information to their client that an agent knows that's relevant to the client's decision making. And that's an important part. You can never provide all the information because they won't listen to it. They won't sit still. And it's too late. What you have to do is make a judgment call. And you do. Every client you work with, you make a judgment call on what you think is important, what you think is relevant. When you do that, you've just made some decisions for your client. Even though you're clear, the client is the decision maker. We know that's the fact. We know that's how that works. But when you decide not to ask this or not to give that information because it's not relevant to their decision making, or it's information because the type of client you've got and just so easily tilts over to the paranoid side and gets overwhelmed and freezes and can't make any decisions at all. And so you'll make judgment calls about how far you go in some conversations. The risk of that is you might be wrong. You might, you know, have skipped something that you don't think is relevant and discover later, oops, yeah, they really didn't even know that. That's a judgment call. That's a risk. You know, the concept behind a judgment call is the risk that you might end up in front of a judge. And that's the risk of a judgment call. So you're absolutely right, Jana. As we go through this, we've got to determine in some way, shape, or form what's relevant. But you're right. This is a very effective way, the way Jana brings this up, this is an effective way for us to communicate to our client their responsibility. When we ask the buyer how much they'd like to offer, and they say, wow, I don't know, what do you think? You know, you'll go through the process. You'll discuss the market. You'll discuss how hot the property is or not hot. You know, you'll discuss, do CMA, all those things. You'll provide all that information. But somewhere in doing that, you're going to make it clear to them, even though I've given you all this information, buyer, it's going to be your decision. You're the one that's going to have to decide. You have that responsibility. It's your money. You're going to live in the property. You're going to have to sell it. You know, this is totally you I'm providing you good information. But Janice White, as we go through this process, ask questions and put responsibility on them. You need to help them understand it, because one of the greatest challenges we have in track complaints and lawsuits is when the client says, you know, my agent never told me that. And we just trusted my agent to know what they were doing. And if it was important to us, they just said something. Well, that's not good. We don't want to be in that position. So as we go through it, we have to do that. Okay, now, anything else before we get to the fifth concept? In number 5, effective questions may be more important than your presentation. And clearly, good questions accompanied with a good presentation are a great combination. Can you imagine how ineffective a presentation would be? It was just totally one-sided and there were no questions, nothing in the presentation that gave your client the opportunity to give input. But we do this. I mean, some agents, and it happens until they get some really good training. Sometimes it happens in the early years. Sometimes it happens, we'll have someone who gets into real estate and they used to be in sales, and it used to be a high pressure type sales. And they were really good at presentations. I mean, they had it locked. I mean, they had all the personality, they had the knowledge, they had worked through the process, and they could just sell. But it was all one way. And these people, until they were trained and learned right, it takes some, they go on a listing presentation and they start the listing presentation and they weren't paying attention to the reaction of the seller, and the seller was impressed and the seller was ready to sign off. But the new agent who was used to the high pressure, whoa, not yet. I'm not through with my presentation. It's a great presentation. You're going to love it. And they missed the client because the client was ready to sign off. But the agent was determined to really finish off this presentation, keep going, and just didn't work. So we've got to we want to have those together. The key is effective questions in a presentation are going to move that presentation forward. And we've already established that you've got a script. And because you've got a good script and you know what you're going to say and you have to think about it, you will have in that script and that presentation key effective questions that will move you and the client and the prospect forward to a successful solution, because you've got those effective questions within your presentation. Both of those are good and they're scripted, because even with all the variables we deal with, there's some simple basic questions, and we'll look at as we'll get into the contract and addenda that fall into certain categories, and that you'll see over and over and over and over again. Every once in a while I'll get a phone call. Well, not every once in a while, regular basis. And the agent will say, gee, Bob, I've never had one of these before. In fact, one of the addenda we're going to look at is a backup contract addendum. And one of our agents, she's got some good experience. She's been with us about 3 years. A good producer. She's in our top 20%. And she'd never had a backup. Never had a transaction with a backup. And so her first deal with the backup, she made the phone call. And she called me because we kind of had a relationship, because I had worked with her on some other things. And she called me and said, okay, never had a backup before, so can we talk about how we do this? Now, it's a good agent, and hopefully you guys are all patient with me when I sometimes get a little pushy. And I got a little pushy with her, and I said, okay, some great question. I'll be happy to talk to you about it, but let me ask you, have you read the addendum? Have you read the backup contract addendum? What I prefer to do is have you read the addendum. After you've read it, let's discuss your questions, because many of your questions will be answered in the addendum itself. Now, I absolutely agree. Some of the way that, especially paragraph A of the addendum, is the language in there, you could interpret in different ways. I understand that even after reading it, you say, well, tell me what that really means. And fortunately, I was on the vocabulary committee where we wrote that paragraph, and I have a little sense of kind of what we meant, so we can have the conversation. And we will talk about the backup contract addendum in this class. So as you go through the process and deal with it, there are things that we all have that we've never had before, and now we got it. And I say, but it's going to fit a category. It's going to be something that's in there as you work through it. So does everybody in concert, everybody agree with me? Really good questions in a presentation make that a better presentation every time. If you just make a one-way, straight from you to them presentation, and then your presentation, you hand them the form, says sign here. Yeah, it's not the best, is it? So good questions, good presentation. I agree with Charles. That absolutely is correct. So that's good. Now, the sixth concept here. Good question scripts are as important as any other scripts an agent learns. Now, I've kind of talked about this a few times, but here's your challenge. And we've started off talking about this in the very beginning. And number 2, how a question is asked is very important. Asking the right person. It's not only a request for information delivery. Once you understand, and hopefully from this class you will understand a little bit better, the importance of questions and how those work, how it works. There are certain kinds of questions that you'll have over and over again with every buyer you have, every buyer. And there are questions you'll have for every seller whose listing you take over and over again. Well, because you know that, go ahead and create the questions and practice those scripts. And many of you have script partners and you go through the process. I know, Charles and Joe and Laura and Selena, you guys have your coach people and you have them practice scripts back and forth. And it's very valuable because you practice it back and forth and you know how you're going to say it and what you're going to say. So by going through the process and doing that, you will find that you have the same ones over and over again, and you're really good at being able to do them. And by doing this, it'll be easier for you to add the new ones because you've already got the ones that you say, hey, yeah. Because there's a question, by the way, for every buyer that you need an answer to. Sometimes they'll tell you before you ask. If they don't tell you, you always have to ask. Why are they buying? You need to know why a buyer's buying. Buying a house is not an easy process. Aside from just the money issue of it, riding around with somebody you may or may not know, looking at houses, even though you're not going to be in the same car, you're going to meet with them, going through that process, having to talk to a lender, dealing with the offer, working with the whole process. It's a real pain. You need to have a good reason for doing it. And some of them don't. You would be foolish to think that this doesn't exist. This person is a little lonely and likes to look at houses, and you're the agent du jour that they've chosen to show them houses. They're never going to buy one. That's not their intent. They just want to look at houses, and they'll use you to help them look at houses. You think that doesn't exist, you're not paying attention, because it does. That's just the nature of kind of how that is. So what we want with a buyer is we want to know why they're buying. And don't we also want to know why a seller's selling? We've got one going on right now. It's actually out of my Rockwall office. And the seller has been very upfront, very honest. Seller has some prime property. It's actually land. It's lakefront land. And it's really attractive property. And in the conversation, our agent interacting with that seller and finding out, what's their thought here, why they're selling. Seller just was very straightforward, very honest. Says, I'm just looking for somebody to make me unreasonably rich. I need for somebody to pay me a lot of money. I don't care if it's worth it or not worth it. That's what I'm looking for. Well, it's kind of important to know that's what the seller's thoughts are. That's going to impact on how realistic you think it is, how much time, energy, money you're going to spend marketing that property. Maybe a really attractive piece of property, but given that seller's ideas of, yeah, here, I'll sell it under these circumstances. Make me unreasonably rich. You do that, we got a deal. Well, one of my problems, and I asked the agent, said, so do we know a number? Do we know the number that seller has that would satisfy being made unreasonably rich? He said, well, no, he hadn't really given me a number. He kind of led me to believe, he says, no, I'll know it when I see it. Well, really? Do I want to spend a lot of time, energy, and money marketing a property that I don't have any idea whether the seller is going to do it? So as you go through the process and deal with all those questions, there's some questions you're going to ask every buyer, every seller. Why are you buying? Why are you selling? I mean, it's going to ask you. And there are a whole other host of questions that you know, and you'll practice a script. You want to find out from a seller. And I kind of use this in a joking phrase, but it's important. You kind of need to ask the seller, what causes you to think you own this property and have the right to convey title? Now, so I said, Bob, that's kind of a silly question. Obviously, they own it. They live in it. You're on the tax roll. Obviously, they own it, or they wouldn't be trying to sell it. Really? Maybe, maybe not. Because that's when we discover the fact is that they have a spouse. We had this. One of our agents had a spouse, female, woman. And everything's going good. Everything is no challenge. We're looking good. Actually, get a good contract. The agent gets a good contract for that seller. And that seller was on the tax roll. So that seller had no question that she owned the property and had a right to sell it. Well, the agent gets a call from the title company. And the title company says, in our search, we've discovered a husband. Is that going to impact on her ability to sell the property? She's married. There's a husband deal. So our agent called her up and said, are you married? And now, guys get accused of this all the time. There's a lady. And the agent said, it was so funny, she's literally slapped her hand and said, oh, you know, I forgot I was still married. What had happened is she and her husband had separated 9 years ago. He lived in another state. I mean, she really had just forgotten that she still had a husband. They hadn't gone through the process, but she couldn't sell the house without his permission. Now, fortunately, he was fine with it. He said, I don't need anything. I'm good. You sell the house. What do I need to do? So it worked out okay. But the reality is, we thought she owned the house. We thought she was the total authority in selling. Wasn't the case. So sometimes we need to ask some questions carefully. You're probably not going to say to that single lady that you're going to list her house, by the way, you married? You ever been married? You got anybody we ought to know about? You're probably not going to have that direct conversation. But it's information you'll need to know. You should kind of work through the process. So it's pretty important. Now, and so you're going to ask those kind of questions in every transaction. So you'll develop scripts for every one of those. Now, our final concept before we get into the contract and addenda, the final concept is questions should be asked in a manner that not only makes it easy to be answered by the person you direct the question to, they actually want to answer the question. The manner in which it is, the environment that you create when you ask that question is one that they're comfortable with. It may be a hard question. It may even be hard to answer, but you ask it in such a way that they were comfortable going through the process and answering it. In fact, you ask it in such a way that they want to answer it. They want to help. They see it's important. You need to really create that type of environment as you go through that helps that. Does that make sense? Anybody have any thoughts on that before we move on to the forms? No? Okay, so do you have the contract forms and the addenda? Do you guys have that in your stuff there somewhere? Do you or do you not? Because I haven't gotten a response yet from Lori or Laura or anybody like that about sharing forms or information. Any thoughts here? Anybody have anything?
There was a contract and addenda included with the handout that Lori emailed out this afternoon.
Okay, okay,
Yes,
Okay,
there
good.
was. I got it.
okay, good. And I've just lost everybody, so I got to get everybody back. I just did something that took everybody back. Where's Dick Dillingham when you need technology help? Okay, here we are back. Okay, so I want us to talk a little bit about the 1-to-4 family contract now. And this is the current one. Upper right-hand column, date 2/12/18. We've talked in 2 previous classes. We will probably do another one maybe later this month after the TREC meeting in 2 weeks where they're going to approve the revised. We'll probably do another one emphasizing best practices because we'll have that voluntary time frame from later this month till March 31st to use either the new one or this current one. And it'll be really incumbent upon you to know the difference between the two. We have an opportunity coming up, and I kind of mentioned it in the best practices. We're about, when we have changes to the contracts, it's always a little bit of a challenge. This is fairly unique because of some of the unique changes that are being made. We have a situation where if you'll take the time beyond what we normally do, really take the time. You already know the current contract, but look at the revised one. You've got the red line version. You've got it available. We sent it out in the material in the previous 2 classes. Should have it there, and it shows you the changes and what it is and the 2 new addenda. I would encourage you to really, really look at those changes, understand what it means to a buyer and a seller. This will become a way for you to really shine. You can make this part of your listing presentation during that time frame, helping that seller understand, one of the things that might happen is put the house on the market and you might get an offer on the new revised form. The seller won't even know there is a new revised form, but the new revised form could really impact you, the seller, in several different ways, depending on what's going on the property. If you have any fixture leases, any smart devices, if it's important to you about the option fee, there are a lot of things in there. And without bragging about it, you want your prospect about to become your seller client to know, the differences, the changes, how it'll affect them. And you can say that in a way that they will say, wow. But I will promise you, 80% of the agents that they talk to won't be able to do that. They won't know that. This is your opportunity by doing a little additional homework and really understanding these revisions. This is your opportunity to help them see that you're separated from the group, from the crowd, that you're a different and a better and agent in so many different ways, and it's going to make them feel so much better about you. Same thing with the buyer. Helping a buyer understand, depending on what's on the property, it may well be that what you need to do is use the new contract forms, the revised contract forms that are available now. Maybe you might want to use them, but the buyer won't be able to know if he wants to use them or not if he doesn't have an agent who can explain it to him. Yeah, here's what's in this new contract form that impacts on you, the buyer, and may be important in the transaction. And because I'm familiar with this, I've had a lot of training on them. I myself have read through them. I've analyzed them. I've looked at them. And so I can help you, the buyer, understand whether or not you want to still use the old form, if that's a better offer for you, or a new one. But here's something that will happen. I mean, it will. Hot piece of property. A lot of offers. Let's say 5 offers. Your buyer likes the new forms. And maybe there's not anything in the transaction that's huge that has to be done. But it may be that there's just enough about the new form that the buyer likes it and says, yeah, I want to use that. So we got 5 offers. I will tell you the other 4 agents won't know enough to know to use a new form. They're probably using the old form. Now, that might put your buyer at a disadvantage because the listing agent may not have a clue about the new forms And when the listing agent is presenting the offers to the seller, and the seller looks at these 5 offers, and there are 4 of them, and those 4 are all some good offers. Well, so was the 5th offer. You're all good offer. But the seller says, you know, I just right off the top of my head, this looks different. This is a different form. How does this different form affect me? What's this? And if the listing agent is not really sure and can't explain it, the seller said, well, you know what, let's go with the tried and true. Let's go with, you know, an offer, these other officers that are on the forms that we're really familiar with. Let's use those. Using the new form might put your buyer at a disadvantage unless there are things in the property, such as fixture leases, that are addressed in the new form, the new forms, the new addenda, that could really be important to the buyer and seller. So, you know, your buyer needs to understand, you understand how this works. You understand the difference in the forms. You understand how it might affect your buyer, how it might affect the seller, how it might affect your buyer's offer being accepted. So you've got some good things. Molly, you had a question here? You look like you had a question.
I'm
Well,
good.
you went off mute, so I thought, well, Molly may have a question. So do we see how, by being familiar with these 2 versions, how important this is going to be for you? This is your opportunity to shine. This puts us in a position to have an advantage over a lot of other agents, even agents in other KW offices and big offices that quote unquote get training. None of them, I mean, in the last 2 classes we did on the revised forms, remember, we had Charles Kramer, the attorney Charles Kramer, the co-chair of the Tract Broker Lawyer Committee. He's the attorney co-chair of that committee. He was in the room when all these changes were made. Consider the advantage of having him there in our training. We've got such a plus there. Have so much more than so many other people. Please take advantage of it. Now, having said that, the 1 to 4 family contract form, as we've got here, and hopefully you have one there. Most of you probably memorized it anyway. But from the perspective of these 7 concepts and the question we're dealing with, when we look at this first page of this contract form, and we look at questions, you know, we're going to go through the process, and some things are just automatic. Some things we've talked about in many, many classes, the variables on the seller's names, the buyer's names, things like that, addresses of the property. But questions dealing with exclusions can become important. You know, if you have the buyer, your buyer needs to know they don't have to honor a request of the seller for exclusions. But it probably needs to be pretty important, because if it's a hot piece of property with other offers and an exclusion that the seller has indicated through their agent in MLS or in some other way in the graphics, if this is not critical for the buyer, it would really affect their offer if they don't, in their offer, go ahead and put that exclusion in there. You know, the seller wants to take the custom chandelier in the formal dining room because it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and the sellers had taken the old builder chandelier and put this custom chandelier up there. It's a $2,000 chandelier. It's really nice, but they're going to take it. And the seller indicates that to the buyer. Well, the buyer needs to make sure if they don't allow this exclusion, if they don't put it in the offer, that could really impact on the offer being accepted and becoming contract. So they really need to decide. If the buyer says, you know, that is a beautiful chandelier, I agree, it's gorgeous. But what's more important to us, and they say this to their agent, is that we get a contract and we get the house. We're not going to lose this house because of that chandelier. And now we may ask the seller to, you know, certainly they're going to take the chandelier down. If they can't do it before we contract, at least before closing. In fact, because the seller is going to have to hire somebody to do it, when they do that, we'll go ahead and provide the new chandelier. And if the seller would go ahead and put the new chandelier up, they take the old one down so we don't close on the deal and there's just stuff hanging there in the dining room and we got to hire somebody to do it. So the buyer may say, you know, we'd like for them to do this, or the buyer may say, you know what, we're not going to create no ripples. We want to make this as easy as possible for the seller because we know they've got other offers. we want them to accept our offer. So you'll have that conversation. You'll ask the questions. You'll find out how important the chandelier is, and you'll be conveying information to your buyer. Here are your options, and here's what the choice of those options can do to impact on your offer. Especially if you've got a buyer who has already lost out on 3 or 4 different deals for a lot of different reasons. They are so frustrated. They're saying, Bob, finding the perfect house is no longer our objective. Getting into a contract is our objective. Let's get into a dang contract. You help us do whatever we need to do to get into a contract. And so with that new, demand that they have, that's going to change a little bit what you do and how you do it as you go through it. So on this first page, going through those questions and deal with that. Things as simple as paragraph 5, the earnest money. This has gotten to be an almost standard kind of thing. Typically 1% of the sales price is a typical amount of earnest money. $500,000 sales price, $5,000 earnest money, somewhere in that range, but totally negotiable. And so if you were to ask the buyer, says, okay, we're going to make an offer. We've agreed in 3C on what the sales price would be. So we're good with that. You're not going to ask it this way, but one of the things you'll want to know from your buyer, because you've already had the conversation with your buyer, here are the times you're going to have to come up with cash. First money, option fee, inspection, here, and you give them the times for all that. So what you want to do now is have the conversation with your buyer about, well, let's talk about the earnest money. How much earnest money were you thinking about? What do you want to do? And the buyer's going to say, well, I don't know. What's acceptable? What's normal? What's good? What should we do? You say, well, here's what's normal. Here's what we see all the time. However, this is a really hot piece of property. There are going to be multiple offers. And as a general rule, we don't know for sure, but I'll find out. We don't know for sure if it's important to the seller, but some sellers will look at the amount of the earnest money, and that'll be an important criteria for them to decide which offer to choose. So while it might be normal on this $500,000 piece of property to put up $5,000, you might want to consider putting up $10,000. And depending on your buyer's circumstances, buyer says, you know what, if it's what it'll take to get the house, if we need to put up $10,000, we have no problem with it. Now, we're going to have to transfer funds to do it, so we need to find ourselves with some time to work that. Well, that's what the additional earnest money provision is for. You know how that works. You can advise them on that. But by having that conversation with your buyer, you're getting good information from them, and you're giving them good information as you're going through the process. You let them know, hey, here's what's typical. But for this piece of property, given the situation, here's what you might need to do. Now, if this is a property that's been on the market for 5 months, and it's because maybe it was originally overpriced or for whatever reason, your buyer may be in a much stronger negotiating position, and they may want to say, okay, I understand $5,000 is reasonable and normal. I don't want to just have money sitting there at the title company for the 30, 45 days to take close this deal. So I think maybe I want to put $3,000 up. You can have that conversation, and it probably won't affect their offer becoming a contract on a property that's been on the market longer than it should have. So you'll be able to have that conversation and deal with it. Now, on page 2 of the contract, you've got, it continues from bottom page 1, you've got those 9 exceptions to the title insurance policy. This is the title company in the contract saying to the buyer, here are 9 items, starting bottom page 1, and then go into page 2. Here are 9 items. And the title company says to the buyer, you better resolve all these issues before closing. Because if you have a problem with any of them after closing, don't call us. We can't help you. If you go look at your title insurance policy, there's a whole section in there called exceptions. All 9 of these items are listed, which means the title insurance policy doesn't cover any of these 9 items. Now, I recently taught a contracts class for CCAR, and we had a conversation about different kinds of things. And one of the conversations dealt with 6A8. And everybody, I guess, can see 6A8. And it deals with what? What does 6A8 deal with? Does it deal with the foundation or the roof or the survey? You see number 8 at the top, page 2? What does that deal with?
Survey.
Survey. Thank you, Marcia. Deals with a survey. Now, survey is an exception in the title insurance policy. It's one of the 9. But in number 8, which describes the exception, the title company gives the buyer the opportunity to change this exception. Without a change, it'll read that the exception includes discrepancies, conflicts, shortages in area, boundary lines, encroachments, protrusions, overlapping improvements. All those are exceptions. Title company says you can make all of those go away with one exception. Shortages in area will stay. If the buyer amends this exception, the new language in the title insurance policy in that section of the policy that has exceptions, the new language when it gets to number 8 will say shortages in area. What that means is, title company says, you need to understand, if after you buy the house, if later you find a mistake on the survey and you're not getting the exact square footage of land you thought, there's a shortage in area of the land, don't call us, we can't help you. That exception still remains. We can make all the rest of them go away. If you and your neighbor have a problem with encroachments, file a claim. I'm not going to say you'll win, but you can file a claim because you changed the exception. You took it away. You amended it. And the buyer, this is where a buyer can check off either I or double I, don't amend it, and they'll amend it. And if they amend it, you got to check a box to decide who's going to pay for it. It's a line item, shows up at closing and settlement statement, and either the buyer or the seller pays for it. It's my recommendation. The buyer should be the one who always pays for it. Very minimal. It's 5% of the premium for a title policy. So if the title policy costs $2,000, it costs $100 to amend it. And for doing that, it's a good thing. You certainly, if the buyer is getting an existing survey, they absolutely need to do this. And I would say the buyer probably certainly should pay for it, especially if you're in a multiple offer. You always want to pay for it. You should go through that. But it's negotiable which way you go. Now, while we're talking about this, if it's a commercial transaction and it becomes a commercial transaction, if your buyer is buying it in the name of an LLC, it now became a commercial transaction. And the cost to do this is no longer 5%, it's 15%. It just tripled just because of how the buyer is buying the property. So you need to be aware of that. You need to have that knowledge so that you can deal with it. This is an important exception that can be amended, the only one that can be amended, and it's an important exception as you deal with that you need to understand, because your buyer, this is one of those questions. Anywhere in the contract or an addendum where there's a blank or a pair of boxes, buyer needs to see that blank in those pair of boxes as a question. And the question is, buyer, what do you want to do? Do you want to amend this or not amend it? You want to amend it, you check off the second box, double I. And if you want to pay for it, check off the box, buyer's going to pay for it. These are questions. You need to understand those are questions. You need to have the buyer, have your client understand that's a question. And you need to help the client understand here the pros and the cons, pluses and the minuses of why you might want to do it or not. It's clearly, back to Janice's point, it's the client's decision. They get to decide what they want to do. You need to help them understand this is a question that needs to be answered. You absolutely have to do that. Any questions on 6A8 and how a buyer can amend or not amend and why you should have this conversation? When they get down to this part of the offer, the buyer's making an offer, buyer's going to have to make a decision which box to check, I or double I. buyer, and their question is going to always be, unless they've got significant experience in this, and they may or may not ask you, they may look at you and go, okay, which one do I check? Well, you need to be prepared to explain it to them. Is everybody comfortable now? I've been able to explain that and say, oh yeah, Bob, in fact, we talked about this before, so I'm ready to teach the class. If you're ready to teach class, raise your hand. I'm good with getting some help on this, not a problem. I know Marcia could teach it because she's heard me talk about this 312 times. That's okay.
313.
Oh, see, now 313. Good point. Absolutely good point. Work through it. So we good with that, how that works? So is you deal with that? Now, get down in paragraph 6C, and this stays with the concept of questions. And part of it is what I just said. Every blank, every set of boxes in the contract or any addendum, that's a question. That's a question that's being asked of the buyer and the seller. What do you want to do? In paragraph 6C, we deal with a survey and explains what that means. And there are three choices as you work through it. Everybody knows my bias. I think a buyer should get a new survey. I think new surveys are important for buyers. And I just think that's the way it ought to be. Buyer gets to choose. And I will tell you, the vast majority of the offers from buyers is 6C1. They want to save a few bucks. They want to get to use the seller's existing survey. In fact, even though the buyer may have the seller disclosure notice in which the seller in box 6 says, I don't have a survey, buyer still checks off 6C1, which is kind of crazy, not paying attention. But you have three choices. And the buyer needs to understand what your three choices are. You can use the seller's existing survey, or a buyer, you can get a new survey. In 6C2, you're getting a new survey and you're paying for it. In 6C3, you're getting a new survey and you're asking the seller to pay for it. So the buyer needs to understand, here's some questions, and you need to know what these questions are and the impact of the decision you make as you go through that. So you need to be good with that. And as you look at it, here's a little bit of, and I know you kind of said, Bob, you're preaching again, and I understand the frustration with that. But as you look at questions and how we deal with questions, how we ask questions, the importance of questions, how we're delivering information, as you're filling out an offer for your client, you need to be aware. You need to have a sense of the questions that the form is asking your client. These are not things that you as an agent, oh yeah, we always do this. We always check off this. I mean, you may say, and by the way, we always put in 3 dates. We always put in 5. That happens. And it happens way too often. Should never happen. But what an agent is doing, we'll deal with a couple of big things. Okay, we'll deal with the price. There's some of those kind of stuff. But all the rest of the stuff, this is pro forma. There's the norm. Here's the standard. Here's what we do all the time. I do lots of deals, and this is normal. Don't ever get into that mode. Recognize these are questions of a client. What's in the form is asking the buyer and the seller questions, and they're asking for decisions from the buyer and the seller, saying, hey, what do you want to do here? Now, you need to understand the variables here. For example, we have this happen. Buyer and seller have agreed to share the cost of a new survey. Which box do they check? Well, as we talk to our fine attorneys, mostly our good title company attorneys, and say, what do you think with that? There are 2 ways it can be done. One good attorney said check off 2 and 3. They're both good news, and they're both going to pay for it. I say, well, I understand that, but if I do that, I think in paragraph 11, the business detail should go in there saying buyer and seller agree to equally share the cost of a new survey. And it needs to be clear. Some of the other attorneys said, don't check a box off in 6C. Don't check any boxes. And then in special provisions, put that language. And put the language in, special provision, buyer and seller agree to equally share the cost of a new survey. Now, there's some challenges here when we deal with it. If we don't check a box, there's some important language in 6C2. And it deals with a timeline because both 6C2 and 6C3 have a blank for a number of days, which creates a little bit of a requirement for the parties to obtain a new survey. And in 6C2, if we put, for example, 10 days in 6C2, and then in paragraph 6D, we've got an objections paragraph. And in the little blank, let's say we put 3 days, which is a fairly typical number of days, and it's tied to the timing of the receipt of the last of 3 documents, and you have it in 6D, where you're dealing with exception documents, commitment, and survey. Well, there's important language in 6C2, that last sentence. Buyer is deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. So if the buyer has 10 days in 6C2, but he kind of fudges it a little bit, he says, I don't really want to order up a survey until this deal's looking really good. I feel better about repairs and appraisal like that. So the buyer kind of fudges around and doesn't get the new survey for 20 days after effective date. The buyer's time frame for objections under paragraph 6D is not tied to the timing of actual receipt, but the earlier of the actual receipt or the number of days in 6C2. In my example, when we hit that 10 days, that now establishes the timing for objections to the survey that the buyer hasn't even received yet. So they need to understand that little restriction. If they check off both boxes, they need to understand that language in 6C2 still applies, and that's going to impact on their ability to object. Does that make semi-sense? Do we see the questions that's asked there and how we can advise our client to go through the process? Questions on that? I know Friday afternoon, you guys are being really nice and really good and really quiet. I'm trying really hard not to take it personally. Should I take it personally? Am I going too slow or too fast? Okay.
You're going well.
We're good so far?
Don't worry, Bob.
Okay, we're good so far. Okay,
We're
good. Thank you.
We're great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. As we're continuing the contract, I want you to look on page 4 and look at question 7. Everybody have that? Paragraph 7, property condition. And everything in paragraph 7, in some way, shape, or form, deals with property condition. And that's the case for all paragraphs. Current contract form 24. The main heading for the paragraph tells us this is what's going on in this paragraph. 5, everything in 5 deals with some area of earnest money. In the new contract, some area of earnest money and option fee. So it's really important that as we're going through the process, if we're in a transaction and our buyer has done inspections and now we're looking at perhaps a repair amendment and the buyer wants to have a really good sense of the process and how things go, you need to understand in paragraph 7, we address virtually every issue involved in dealing with repairs, dealing with the property condition, dealing with requests, all those things. It's right here. Starting with 7A that tells the buyer, here's what the seller has agreed. Here's what the seller's agreed, buyer, to allow you access to the property, to do inspections. And here's the cue. Utilities have to be owned all the way through closing so you can do those things. Buyer, you need to know you got those rights. That's set forth. It's in the contract. Of course, if you have the listing, your seller needs to know, yeah, That's you got to do that, and it's really important. It's very important that the seller never do anything to get in the way of the buyer's due diligence, checking out the property. Got to not do that. So right there in 7A, we deal with that issue. Now, an important part of dealing with the condition of the property is the seller's disclosure notice. We had a recent conversation with one of my agents and their client, and part of the conversation dealt with an inspection report from a buyer. Didn't have one yet. In fact, weren't in contract yet. We're going through a conversation, and we talked about the risk of the seller getting the inspection report from the buyer or not getting it. And I said to the seller, I says, well, if you receive a copy of the inspection report from the buyer, this is going to require you to disclose any new information you have about the condition of the property, which may mean that you'll need to make sure your seller's disclosure notice reflects that. Well, the seller's response was, no, I don't want to do that. I said, well, that's not a KW policy. That's not a Bob policy. That's state law. The Texas Property Code, Section 5.008, requires that. She said, oh, okay. Well, I guess if that's a law, I have to do it. Yeah, that's how it is. So we need to understand what's going on with the seller's disclosure notice, what the requirements are. They're very specific in Section 5.008. We have a TREC 4-page seller's disclosure notice that reflects what's actually in the property code. We use the 6-page Texas Realtor seller's disclosure notice that has a minimum plus it has some extra. It's our clear opinion that it's better for the seller to provide more than the minimum. That's why we want them to use the longer form. There are important questions that we think every buyer is going to want to know whether they ask it or not. A buyer's going to want to know if the seller has ever filed an insurance claim. Would everybody agree with that? Well, that's not in the TREC 4-page seller's disclosure. No question about insurance claims. The buyer would also like to know if there are fixtures that are leased or owned. It's not in the TREC form. It's in the Texas Realtor form. So there are questions, there are things that we think are important for a buyer that a seller ought to give up beyond the medium, so it's beyond the minimum. So it's harder for the seller, for the buyer to fuzz the seller. I said, you know what? So, whoa. I did more than I had to. I provided more than the law requires, and I bought you a dang home warranty, and you're fussing at me? It's not working. So by doing that, by that extra diligence, it really improves what's going on there. So the questions that are asked in B, doing seller's disclosure notice. And remember, these are questions of who? Both parties to the contract, buyer and the seller. Buyer, when they're making an offer, they're answering. And the reality is, these are mutually exclusive boxes. Buyer under B1 either has received the notice, or B2 has not received it, or B3 does not require it on the property code to do it. So the buyer gets to make a choice based on what's actually going on. And when the buyer's writing the offer, if they don't have it, say, well, okay, we'll check off too. I don't have it.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Question? Hello? Okay. So these are questions, and the buyer has to make a decision. Now, there's a nonsensical question in B2.
Sorry.
There's a blank. Hello? Question? I keep having Danielle, I think, pop up. I don't think she's muted. Anyway. So there's a blank there for a number of days. In B2, buyer says, I don't have it. And, I'd like to have it in the next 5 days. So they put 5 days in there. That's meaningless. Seller is not required to do it in 5 days. Seller is not in default. Can't sue the seller for it as you go through the process. The buyer can terminate the contract, get their earnest money back, and that remedy is in the contract itself as you go through the process. The 5 days is kind of a suggestion, and what really should go in the blank, you should have a conversation with your buyer. Says, you know what? How do we feel about the seller's disclosure notice and the seller? Buyer says, I don't care. I'm going to do inspections anyway. In fact, I'm going to do a TREC inspection. I'm going to have a roofer come out. I've got an HVAC company coming out. I don't care what the seller says. So in that case, you might put a very long time frame in here. Put 20 days in there. And the listing agent, the seller may say, oh, okay, wow, plenty of time there, good. Keeps your buyer in control of the contract. If you've got 20 days in there and it takes a seller 20 days to get this to the buyer just picked up a 27-day free option period. So this becomes a negotiating point. Now, you may have a buyer who it's really important to them. Say, you know what? I want to know what the seller knows, and I want to know what I can hold the seller responsible for. So, you know what? I'm going to put 5 days in here, and if I don't get it in the seller in 5 days, I'm out of here. I'm going to terminate the contract. And buyer would have that right. In fact, the buyer has the right under 7B2 from day one of the contract to terminate. Because that's what they have, 7B2. They don't have sales disclosure notice, they can terminate all the way to closing. So that's a very powerful right. So the question and the consequences that are being asked. So when the buyer makes a choice and checks off 7B2 and the offer gets to the seller may look at their agent and say, why in the heck are we giving them a free 7, 8 day, 20-day option? What's going on here? I says, well, you know, that listing agent says, you know, that seller's disclosure notice I gave you, I know you've been busy, been traveling, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of important that we get this to the buyer and get it to them right away. Oh, okay. Well, I didn't understand that. So now the seller fills it out, completes it. You send it over. So in the counter offer from the seller, you change 7B2 to 7B1. You take away that right of termination. But you do it because you know what the questions are that are being asked. Everybody good with that? I often hear people talk about, seller says, okay, I'm not going to do any repairs at this price, no repairs. I want everybody to understand this is an as-is contract. Well, it already is. 7D made this an as-is contract. It says so. It tells you that's what it is. It explains a little bit about what that means. And in 99% of all the contracts, you're going to check off D1, property is, buyer accepts property as is. You're only going to check off D2 if the buyer has a repair treatment they know about right now, and they want to put it in there. Not any future event, not subject to inspections, but the buyer says, you know, we noticed there were 2 windows in the master bedroom, that the seal is broken and they're all fogged over. We want those 2 fixed. Well, they can put that in 7D2. But unless they have something like that, they never check off 7D2. It's going to always be 7D1. Had a transaction recently where there were some possible issues with negotiating a repair amendment before closing. In fact, when I got into the conversation, it was the last day of the option period, and it was 4:30. And the buyer's agent, our agent was the buyer's agent, was having trouble getting the listing agent to respond in a timely manner, and they only had 30 minutes. And so, you know, one of the things that the buyer's agent, in this case, if you were the buyer's agent, you need to look at what other rights of termination you might have in the transaction. There was no mandatory HOA in this transaction, so we didn't have that. We had the seller's disclosure notice, so we didn't have that. And I said, so the repairs that you're requesting in the repair amendment, are any of those lender required repairs? She said, well, probably will be. Okay. If they're lender required repairs, this is a great example of a paragraph that we tend to not spend a lot of time on until it actually, you know, involves a transaction. I say, so we need to understand if it's a lender required repair, which is usually a big thing. It's a foundation, it's a roof, it's an air conditioning, it's electrical, it's something major. This creates a significant right of termination for the buyer. If there's a lender required repair, neither party is required to take care of it. But if they don't come to some agreement on taking care of it, this contract's going to terminate, because the lender said, we don't approve the property. It's going to terminate. The buyer gets their money back. So in this situation with this agent, I said, you know, you need to really be reading the language in lender required repair paragraph in 7E, because if you can't get the seller to respond to this repair amendment you sent over in time, and if it becomes a lender required repair, your buyer has significant contingency rights of termination under 7E. And she had never really read 7E before, said, okay, it's good to know. She was able to explain to her buyer, says, here are your options here. Here's something that's pretty important that you could deal with. Now, remember, we're talking condition of property. We got a repair amendment, and a repair amendment, seller agrees to do repairs, and there's some things that need to be done. And on a regular basis, if buyers don't say it, buyers have certain questions, certain expectations. And when the buyer says, seller to do this, seller to do that, seller's agreed to do it, the buyer expects it's going to be done right. It's going to be done according to the law. It's going to be by licensed people. Buyers expecting it to be, the seller's not going to do it on the cheap and do it on their own. They're going to make sure somebody knows what they're doing, does it. That's an expectation of the buyer. Well, the buyer and the agent and the seller need to know what 7F says about doing the repairs. And it does talk about license, but a lot of repairs don't require license in Texas. Roofs don't require license. Sheetrock doesn't require a license. There are a lot of things that can be done. Replacing flooring doesn't require a license. But a buyer says, well, I expect this to be done by somebody who's really good at it. Well, then in the repair amendment, you need to say that. You need to be pretty specific. In fact, if you can, you need to name the roofing company. You need to name the vendor, name the roofer, name the flooring company. You need to understand, because it requires, if there's a license required, somebody with a license has to do that repair. If it's not, it needs to be someone who that's their regular business, not just a seller doing it on the cheap. The language in 7F was meant to keep the seller from doing this on the cheap. That whoever was doing it is somebody who either is licensed or that's their business. And by the way, it's the general consensus that this includes handymen and or handy women. But we understand in this particular paragraph, there's a timeline in there, there's requirements, and here's what the person doing repairs. And the buyer and seller need to be on the same page with what this requires everybody to do. Questions on that property, those property condition kind of things. And see, remember in 7E and 7F both, there are no boxes in there. There are no questions in there. But the seller or the buyer is going to have a question on repair. Say, okay, who's going to do these? Well, you, the buyer's agent, should have made sure in the repair amendment that you address that, even though there's no blank or box or questions in this. Does that make sense? We good with this?
So Bob, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When are they going to add dates for the age of the HVAC system, the hot water heater, and other appliances? Since that's a question that's constantly asked by a buyer, at least an astute buyer. They have it for the roof. Why don't they have it for other major systems of the house?
Yeah, it's a good. So you're talking about in the seller's disclosure notice?
Correct.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's something that certainly a buyer would like to know that information. Here's, there's not anything high on the radar for broker lawyer committee to address this. They haven't had a lot of inquiries on it. That's when they normally will take something like this on. You need to keep in mind, one of the challenges is the seller's disclosure notice is not something that the broker lawyer committee, in fact, adds to, changes, whatever. The Texas realtors on their seller's disclosure notice, they get to change it because it's their notice. The actual seller's disclosure notice requirements, the 4-page track one, is an act of the state legislature because it's an act of the property code. Broker lawyer committee doesn't get to make that changes to that. Now, Texas realtors, if we sent good feedback to Texas realtors, to Lori Levy, general counsel, or whoever else there, saying, hey, this would be something that would really be helpful and taken into consideration. Texas Realtors has a forms revision task force, and they might address that if they get enough feedback from realtors saying, I have my buyers ask us all the time, and we'd really like to see us address this. Now, having said all that, here's one of our challenges with that information. I agree, buyers would like to know it. We have enough trouble getting sellers to know how old the roof is. I think knowing how old the HVAC is even harder. I think you're going to find that that's going to be a guess by most sellers. Most sellers, because you're going to have boxes, you're going to put blanks in there, days, or you're going to have a box that's unknown. I mean, it's just going to be there. And I think you're going to find unknown a lot as you work through it. When the buyer's really concerned about that, and they have an HVAC company go out, HVAC company, I presume, has the ability to determine the age of it, just like they can determine the age of a water heater because that information is on the water heater.
Well, if
But
the
I agree that-
manufacturers wouldn't put it in code and would
I'm
put,
sorry, do what?
if the manufacturers of those systems would not put it in a code, like tires are done, we could all read it and it would be very simple. But the
Yep.
manufacturers make it hard for us or a seller or a buyer to look at a system and see the
Yep.
date.
Yeah. And I'm probably sure there's some good reason why they want to make things harder for us. I don't know what that reason would be, but I'm sure it's so we just went from trying to get Texas self-disclosure notice to do something. Now you want to get the manufacturer of all the water heaters and HVAC to do something. You know, you're ambitious. I like your ambition.
I'll get after it.
Okay. I'm good with that. Not a problem. Okay. Remember, we're talking about questions, work through it. I want to make sure we don't lose the time because I want to make sure we understand some of the important questions and the addendums that we have here as we're going through this. As I look at different questions that we have in the contract itself, I don't have any other questions that just come out over and over and over again. I think we're doing pretty good. I'd like for us to go, hopefully you have in your packet there, the third-party financing addendum. Does everybody have that? Yes, Bob? No, Bob? I don't know, Bob. Where we get that?
Yes, Bob.
We got it? Okay.
Yes.
So something recently happened, and this is a great example of, you know, we all understand we don't read something, don't look at it, don't think about the answer to it until it actually happens to us. And we all, that's a human nature thing that we all have. Well, in the third-party financing addendum, as it was revised in the November 2019 TREC meeting, as a recommendation of broker lawyer, on the second page of the addendum, where it talks about property approval. And property approval is a contingency that has to be done before the third day prior to closing. And the buyer has to have something in writing from their lender saying, here's why we don't approve the property. Now, that does not apply to FHA VA transactions. And you have language down in paragraph 4A, that last sentence before you get to under 4A, before you get to 4A, says, you know, this 3-day does not apply to paragraph 4 because FHA VA rules are so tight, doesn't do that. Well, we had a transaction come up recently, and it was a Texas Veterans Land Deal, which is paragraph B, 1B on the first page of the third-party financing addendum. One of the things we never thought of is that VA rule, because the FHA VA rule is that a buyer can terminate based on property approval all the way to closing. It's no longer the 3-day rule, it's all the way to closing. And so we thought, well, does that apply to the Texas Vets loan program? Fortunately, we were able to go to Charles Kramer, attorney co-chair of Broker Lawyer Committee, and says, okay, just have this happen. Tell me, what's the answer to this? Does it apply? And because he was in the room, I said, so did you guys have a discussion when you made the change? So FHA and VA, that 3-day rule doesn't apply. Did you discuss whether it applies to the Texas Vet or not? Because that's a state program, not the federal VA program. He said, well, we decided 2 different animals and we decided to leave it alone. So the 3-day rule only applies to conventional and it applies to the Texas Vet program. If the buyer is going to terminate based on the Texas Vets land program, because property doesn't approve, the lender doesn't approve the property, probably because of an appraisal issue, they're going to have to terminate before the 3rd day prior to closing. That same rule in paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum is going to apply to everything except any financing in the federal FHA VA programs. So we need to understand that distinction of what we got there, and we really hadn't given it a lot of thought or played with it very much until we actually had that experience. So we're constantly having experiences that make us look at and think about things that say, wow, now we know. Questions on that? Questions on anything in the third-party financing addendum? Okay. Looking at mandatory HOA addendum. And this is an addendum that there was a little bit of a change made, and we'll see this after the February 16th meeting. Not a significant change. I think the Broken Committee thinks it's a bigger deal than I think will turn out to be in the real world. What I want you to be comfortable with from our question perspective in the mandatory HOA addendum, in paragraph A, you've got 4 choices. And again, mutually exclusive boxes, you got to check a box. You need to know when a buyer's making an offer and the property is in a mandatory HOA, you need to know the question that's being asked of the buyer in these 3 choices, because you've got a box to be checked off and you've got a blank for a number of days. And the buyer needs to understand in A1, they're letting the seller pay for things. It's the seller's expense. B, buyer's going to obtain and pay for it. And there are different rights of termination based in B2, in A2 than A1. A3, buyer already has it. Buyer's already got it. They've already approved it. Everything's fine. And it's a whole different termination situation. And A4, buyer says, I don't need it. Now, if they check off A4 where they don't need it, paragraph E of this addendum comes into play. Because if buyer says, I don't need that subdivision information. In fact, for the last 5 years, I've been the president of the association. I wrote half the rules. I don't need this stuff. Well, the title company is going to say, you know what? I'm proud of you. We're glad that you know all that stuff, but we, the title company, are going to need the resale certificate. Who's going to pay for it? So paragraph E comes into play, and you got 2 boxes, buyer or seller. So if we have to have an updated resale certificate, or if the title company needs one, we've got to decide who's going to pay for it. And that's totally negotiated. But we need to know if A4 is checked off, E comes into effect. If A1 is checked off, unless there's some kind of requirement for an updated resale certificate, then E doesn't come into play. You probably should know my feeling about this addendum. I think we miss how powerful a right of termination this is. And if you got the listing, make sure you're getting that information to the buyer as soon as possible so they don't pick up any rights of termination beyond the other rights they already have, such as the option period. Because those rights of termination in this addendum run parallel to the rights of termination in the option, self-disclosure, anything else. And so your seller needs to understand what the buyer is getting if they don't get this information to them in a timely manner. Now, I understand the seller's not in total control of that. The HOA is, and some of them are terrible about that, and some of them are really good about it. And you've got to have a sense of the listing agent on the HOA that your seller's property is in. How's that working? How long does it take them? What does it cost? If we need it in a shorter period of time, it's going to be a rush fee, and how much is that? You need to kind of be on top of all that. We're good with the HOA addendum. Powerful rights of termination, because rights of termination for the buyer in A1 is for any reason. Any reason. Buyer can terminate for any reason. And if the seller doesn't get this to the buyer in the time frame there, the buyer's sole remedy, and it says so in the paragraph, Their only remedy is terminate and get their earnest money back. They can't sue the seller. So seller's not in default. Seller can't be sued if we don't get this information to the buyer within the number of days in A1. You need to understand that you have to be careful because some title companies, when they see that number of days, they'll order this stuff up and they say, well, we don't want the seller be in default. Seller won't be in default. There is no default position there. Going through that. We good? Okay.
Now I'm
How
seeing
about-
Now I'm seeing
Yes.
title companies who are saying that we have to amend that date. They're telling their agents they have to amend that date because they
Really?
can't get the documents fast enough.
Really?
Yes, so it's a new argument now.
Wow. Wow. So I think we need to have the conversation with the title company early on to say, show me your real estate license. Show me how you became a party to the contract and you got to be, the deal here. So I've got a question here from Charles. How would you advise us to ask the question why of a non-KW Plano buyer's agent who checks the seller box in paragraph E? Marcia, I know you see this a lot.
All the time.
Yeah, so here's the key. Doesn't affect anything. If you check off A1 and they check on the box E, doesn't affect anything because if you're not going to get an updated or a new resale certificate, you can deal with the original one. A1 applies, seller pays for it. E doesn't screw anything up. It shouldn't be done. It shows you've got an agent who really hadn't read it. But yeah, just don't let it be a problem. Don't fuss about it. Don't do anything in it. Just move on. Thanks. Good question, Charles. We good with that? Okay, good. Marcia, you see it a lot, don't you?
Yes,
You see
I do.
it's just automatic. I mean, in a lot of our agents, filling out an offer, HOA addendum, get down to E. Oh, the 2 boxes, better check. Okay, we got the buyer. We're going to make the seller pay for it.
Yep.
All the time.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. Ignore it. Because unless there's going to be a requirement for it updated, nothing happens. So you're good.
And the title companies will sometimes automatically order a rush on the HOA documents.
Oh, yeah.
They ask the seller.
A bad title company does that. They'll order up because if you've got 3 days in there, 5 days in there, talking to, well, we want to keep the seller being in default, so we're going to order it up. I know there's a rush fee. Well, we smile when we say it, but we say to the title company, guess what? You're going to pay the rush fee because you didn't have authority from us or our seller client to order it up, without talking to us. You're going to pay the rush fee. And they're either going to pay the rush fee or we're just not going to do business with them anymore because they're idiots. Oops, did I say that out loud? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
I'm rubbing off
We
on
got some big, good title companies out there who do this. And it drives me up the wall. And I just go, wow, man. Okay, look at the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. Everybody can kind of see that real quick. There are lots of questions on this form. You've got the buyer about has a house to sell. They need to understand what's going on here. They're using this addendum to protect themselves. The buyer saying, seller, happy to buy your house, getting my money from the sale of my other property. If I can't get the money, you don't get to sue me. I'm not in default because I use this addendum and I put a date in paragraph A. And if when that date hits, I don't have the money or I have to waive the contingency, I understand my contract terminated. Buyer understands it because they're a good agent. They're KW Plano agent. Explain it to them. Hopefully the listing seller understands it. But you've got an important question there. In A, the first question to ask the buyer is, tell me about the property you got to sell. That's the address that probably goes in the first blank. The amount of time the buyer needs to get that money is in the second blank. And it's a kill date. Unless the parties change this date or unless the buyer waives it, automatically kills that contract. Now, paragraph B is our kick-out paragraph. Seller continues to show the property. Seller accepts another offer on a backup basis. When the seller accepts another offer, he's got to notify your buyer because your buyer's in contract, contingency contract. The seller's got to say to your buyer, hey, to accept another offer on a backup, you got to waive the contingency or you're out of here. And there's a blank for a number of days. So the question is being asked of the buyer and kind of the seller, how many days do you want? Well, the shorter the time frame, the better for the seller. The longer the time frame, the better for the buyer. we kind of reach a happy medium. Somewhere around 3 days, max 5 days is something that goes in there. Buyer says, well, you know what? I got your notice, seller. We got to talk to our bank. We got to talk to our lender. We've got to see if we can get a bridge loan. We got to find out how that contract that we've got on the other property is going. Did we get through option? Are we getting ready to close? How's that all looking? So the buyer may need 3, 4, 5 days to make a decision on it. So some kind of a reasonable time frame. So those are important questions in there. You need to understand what they're doing, what they're asking your client, and dealing with it. Questions on that? We good? Before I go to the backup contract addendum? Everybody good? Yes, Bob. Okay, good. Addendum for backup contract. It's a one-page procedure. We have it in our intranet, and it's how to split up the earnest money and the option fee in a backup. It also explained how to do it in a short sale. But what we're talking about now is a backup. Because if your buyer ends up in a backup contract with a seller, then this contract your buyer's in is the second contract, is already a first contract, and it's a binding contract, but its existence is contingent on the existence of a first contract. And the effective date of that first contract goes in that blank in A, that goes through, is contingent on the termination of previous contract. The date says that's the effective date of the first contract. You get that information from the listing agent. So when the seller accepts your buyer's backup, at that point in time, when that becomes a binding contract, your buyer owes the earnest money and the option fee. Now, if your contract, your backup never gets into the first position, your buyer's going to get the earnest money back, but they will not get the option fee back. Whatever they pay, and then they need to pay something right up front, they'll never get that back. So we want to split it up. If we were going to pay a $200 option fee, let's pay $25 now, the other $175 when the backup moves to the first position. That way, the only risk to the buyer is that $25. And you'll put that in the contract, and that one-page thing we have on the internet explains exactly the process, gives the example how to do it. And your buyer wants to do that because your buyer does want an option period, because your buyer may still be out and say, you know what, this is the best thing we've seen for, so let's get into a contract. But you know what, we found that other house over here, maybe we might want to make an offer on it. Buyer wants to stay in control. By having paid something in an option fee up front, they're in control. And they get to move through that process, and they get to do that. So it's really important, buyer understand right up front. Now, none of the performances start. Any performance that's tied to the effective date of the contract doesn't start till the backup becomes the first, which means the timeline for third-party financing, any time frames in the contract, which is most of them, that are tied to the effective date, none of them start until the backup becomes the first. And that is what we call the amended effective date, the date the seller gives notice to the backup buyer, hey, first contract's gone, you're now the first. That's the amended effective date. So the option period, for example, while the buyer paid something up front and has a right from day one to terminate the contract because he paid something, his right of termination will go from then to the amended effective date, which is when the backup buyer became the first, and then for the number of days in the option period, say 10 days. So your buyer has from day one to the amended effective date, and then 10 days after that to terminate under the option provision because he paid something up front. And so, but none of the performance, so you won't do inspections yet, you won't expend any money on anything yet. None of that has to happen until you get into the amended effective date, which is the day that the buyer gets notice from the seller that the buyer is now in the first position. Questions on that?
I have a question.
Yes.
So those are all the so the dates that have like a certain number of days, like 10 days, 17 days. As far as the closing date though, since that would vary considerably depending on if and when that contract.
Okay. Timothy has brought up a great question. In paragraph 9 of the contract, when your buyer writes this offer on this backup, in paragraph 9, where we have the closing date, he's exactly right. We don't know when the backup will come up first. And so in the addendum in paragraph B, you're probably going to have the closing date of the first contract. Well, let's say it's 1 day before that day when that first contract terminates. Are you going to be able to do all your stuff in 1 day? Of course not. So what you'll do in paragraph 9 of the backup contract, of any contract, paragraph 9, closing date, you're not going to put a date. You're going to reference to special provision. You say, you know, the closing date will be 20 days after the amended effective date. You're going to tie it to the amended effective date. So that, and I just threw 20 days out as an example. Timothy, it could be 30 days, depending on the nature of the transaction your buyer has. You may say, wow, we got to do a lot of inspections. You got to do this. We may need 30 days. Well, you may need, 20 days. Whatever the time frame is, you're going to put it in there, and it's going to be tied to the amended effective date. That's a really great point you brought up, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that becomes important when you're writing the backup offer. Dealing with the closing dates, you need to have a number of days, not a date, because we don't know when the backup may become the first, if in fact it does. So great point. Good job, Timothy. Anything else on that? We good? Because we're pretty much just about using up all of our time as we deal through this. The only other thing that I want to do, you've got the amendment form. Make sure you know what the amendment form is, what it is, and there's some changes that we're going to find ourselves dealing with in the future that I don't think the Broker Lawyer Committee or the commissioners understand the evolution we're going to go through and the impact of some of this that the new forms will have. But we're going to find that out as it goes through it. The notice of termination of contract form, you need to understand that this form only deals with termination of the contract, does not deal with the release of the earnest money, and it says so on the form itself. Release of earnest money is governed by the contract. So what you're doing here is terminating. You're picking a choice as you work through it. I think it's interesting when we get the new contracts in place, revised contracts, there are several rights of termination of the buyer that are not listed here at all. They didn't make those changes. And so you're going to have to check off number 8 and list the particular provision that's a new right of termination that's not now listed in the first 7. So that'll be a little bit of a change you have there. The seller's notice of termination contract is almost exclusively dealing with the earnest money issue in paragraph 5. Buyer did do it in 3 days, selling, terminate, and go through that. I should work through it. We're at 3:30, guys. In spite of how incredibly quiet you are, I'm very optimistic that that's a respectful quiet. Are we good with that? Very respectful quiet. I don't think I've ever sat with Brad Mattern this long and he didn't say anything. And I guess maybe that's because Jessica wasn't in the room prompting him. Is she in the room there, Brad? Or she's saying, just be quiet because I'm working over here, Brad. And she's probably being very diligent. You guys are wonderful. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. Thank you for all you do for us. Please see what you can do, and I'm going to work on it too, about trying to get into the office so we can begin to get that synergy going back up. And I do want to have a special, hello, Jessica. Hey. I want to have a special thanks out to so many of you. Want all your prayers and wishes for myself, my wife, and get through this stuff, especially Elizabeth, and for the meals you provided. They were incredibly helpful. We were very appreciative. Thank you very, very much. I'm so proud to be in business with you and be in this KW Plano family. So thank you very much with everything. And, I look forward to us moving forward in next week and whatever we do. So thank you. And please give me good feedback on, what else we need to talk about, because in the future class, we want to make sure we're dealing with what you need in and every day. So thank you very much. If no one has anything, this meeting is adjourned. We're moving on.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I didn't know you were going to be gone today. I have to take Travis to the doctors this afternoon. What? He can't play sports until they have it's cleared by the doctor.